Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of their history, culture, geopolitical context, and weaves in some of the stories that I brought back from those countries when I worked there and some of the very interesting people I met along the way. And you found out about one of those in our first episode about Vietnam last week with my minder while I was in during my trips to the country, Lan, and we'll talk a little bit more about Lan today. Before I jump into a deep dive of the conflicts that occurred in the 20th century in Vietnam that really shaped its political and economic future, I want to share one more recollection with you. As I said in the episode last week, Vietnam is a location where I'd always wanted to travel, and my first trip there was predominantly focused in the north. During my second trip, I was able to get to the Central Highlands and to the south, not to Saigon per se, or Ho Chi Minh City as it is called now. It was called Ho Chi Minh City from April 30th, 1975 on, after the fall of the South Vietnamese government. But I did get to a place that I'd always wanted to go, and that is Mai Kea Beach, which was colloquially known by the American soldiers that took in-country R&R there during the Vietnam conflict, China Beach. And of course was the subject of a television show that I liked very much in the 1990s called China Beach. It was important for me to go there for several reasons, but one of those reasons was that it really exploded some of the conceptions that I had about the that period in history and about that location in general. I mean, now Mai Kea Beach is surrounded by hotels and restaurants and shops. But my understanding and my research has shown me that during the time that the Americans were there, it was a very pristine white sand beach on the South China Sea, location where the soldiers could unwind, surf, throw a frisbee, otherwise relax before they went back into the quote-unquote boonies. And it still has white sand to this day. It still has a beautiful water, still a lot of surfing going on there, but it is much different than I imagined it to be. Just like my first trip to the old city of Jerusalem. In your mind as a child or a young person, you read about these locations and you get in your mind what they should look like. And certainly the old city of Jerusalem was much different than I thought it would be. And China Beach, or Mai Kea Beach, was as well. And I tried to explain this to Lan at the time. And she looked at me like I was a cross between a unicorn and Bigfoot. She couldn't understand why I was even interested in going there, number one. But secondly, I had no context about the television show China Beach or its connection, its important connection to the conflict in Vietnam. And so it's a little bit lost on her, but we walked on the white sand and I took some photos and enjoyed it very much. But that reference to Mai Kea Beach, China Beach, really leads us to a discussion of what happened in the 20th century to shape Vietnam. Well, what happened then actually started much earlier. It started in 1883 when the French came to what is now North and Central Vietnam. And in 1887 incorporated Vietnam into French Indochina. French Indochina, it was part of French Indochina until just after World War II, when the Communist Freedom Movement, Viet Minh, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and others, began to fight against French forces. And this led to the First Indochina War, which lasted from 1946 to 1954. And the French were actually defeated in 1954 and forced to give up their hold on French Indochina, or Vietnam. This war also created a divided Vietnam, divided by an arbitrary line between North and South, with the North adhering to the principles of communism and being aligned with the Soviet Union at that time, China, and North Korea, and the South, which was aligned with the United States and its allies, and focused on the growth of democracy and capitalism. The ruler, of course, in the North was Ho Chi Minh, and in the South at that time it was Ngo Dinh Diem, both of whom played a very instrumental role in the policy and the actions that led to the Vietnam conflict. But during this First Indochina War with the French, the Viet Minh losses were extraordinary, between 175,000 and 300,000 dead. The French Union, which consisted of France, Cambodia, Laos, and what was called the State of Vietnam, which is a lot of what became South Vietnam, had huge losses as well, about 120,000 soldiers, of which more than 20,600 were French. The rest were Cambodian, Laotian, and soldiers from the State of Vietnam. And in addition, more than 125,000 civilians were killed, possibly up to 400,000, and the true number is probably closer to the 400,000 than the 125,000. So it was an extremely bloody conflict, but it did lead to a portion of what Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh wanted to achieve, which was the promulgation of North Vietnam as a communist state. But Ho and his leaders never took their eyes off of South Vietnam. They believed that Vietnam was one country and should be unified under the principles of communism. Likewise, the leaders in the South believed that the country should be unified under democratic principles. And therein laid the foundation, set the stage, if you will, for what came next. And what came next was the proliferation of one of the most controversial and bloody conflicts in the recent history of the United States. Now, there's a reason that I call Vietnam a conflict and not a war. And I want to be very sensitive to this, because I have huge respect for every man and woman who served in Vietnam, whether they were drafted or whether they volunteered. My respect for them is imminent. They're heroes, one and all. I don't care what they did in terms of how they supported that war effort, whether it was in the as an infantryman, as a nurse, as a pilot, as a logistics specialist. Doesn't matter how they served. Every one of them is a hero in his or her own right. But I think that it is important to make this distinction between a war and a conflict. Vietnam was never a declared war. When the United States sent the first troops to Vietnam, it did so under an authorization to deploy combat forces under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The United States Congress never declared war on the Socialist Republic of North Vietnam. Therefore, the term war is a misnomer. We have to term it as a conflict. But nonetheless, it was a conflict in which the destruction was vast and the implications, not just on Southeast Asia, but on the world, were vast as well. So let's unpack this a little bit. The U.S. military was involved from a combat forces standpoint from 1965 to 1973. The first combat troops were sent to Vietnam in 1965. However, did you know that advisors were first sent to Vietnam in 1950 by Harry S. Truman? And then John Kennedy expanded the number of advisors as he believed very strongly that the domino effect in Southeast Asia would be triggered by Vietnam falling to the communists. We'll come back to that in just a few moments. But as far as combat troops being deployed to Vietnam from the United States, that occurred in 1965. And one of the most high-profile aspects of that combat deployment was the first real battle in which the Americans participated, the Battle of Ya Drang, which occurred from November 14th through 18th, 1965. If you've read the book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and I hope you have, or seen the movie. I hope you read the book first and then seen the movie. But whichever you did, I think that it is extremely important to understand the ramifications of this first battle. It was much more than just a battle. It really set the tone for the trajectory that both sides would use during much of the rest of the war. With the escalation of U.S. advisors coming to Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and the leaders in the North thought it was inevitable that the United States would eventually enter into an armed conflict. And so, building up to these dates in November 1965, the North Vietnamese had a lot of time to strategize as to how they would approach Americans on the battlefield. They knew much more at that time about the Americans than the Americans really knew about the Vietnamese. And so when Lieutenant Colonel Howell Moore and his 7th Cavalry deployed to the Ya Drang Valley in November of 1965, and that battle ensued, there were surprises on both sides. First of all, the U.S. forces were going up against a vastly larger force of mostly North Vietnamese regulars, sprinkled in with their more grassroots military movement of the Viet Cong. But most of the soldiers that fought against U.S. forces in the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965 were well-trained North Vietnamese soldiers most of whom had fought in the First Indochina War and were very used to, certainly their commanders had fought in that war, and they were very used to conflict. And they used a technique in that battle called hugging, where they knew that the United States had huge amounts of artillery and firepower, and so they came in so close to the Americans that the artillery was really useless. And by doing this, and by cutting off various factions of Hal Moore's force, they were able to equalize the fight and use their superior numbers to, at first, overwhelm the Americans. But over the course of the 4 days, even with huge losses and elements of Hal Moore's forces being cut off from each other, the Americans fought back, and the legacy of LZ X-ray is still talked about in military circles today. It was a huge fight, and it was one that really defined both sides. The Vietnamese learned that the Americans were not going to run. They were very committed. They were committed to fighting. They were well trained, and they were able to grasp at least a stalemate out of what should have been a certain defeat for the American forces. The Americans found out a little bit about the tactics of the North Vietnamese, which was this hugging technique and then deploying forces in different directions to divide and conquer American forces. And this led to the understanding, really the first understanding from the American side of how the Vietnamese were going to approach this war. The Americans assumed when entering Vietnam, and I've talked to several former leaders of troops in Vietnam at that time, as well as several political leaders. The belief was that America's firepower could overwhelm the North Vietnamese. That yes, we would take some losses, yes, it would take some time, but eventually our air superiority, our artillery, and the sheer mechanization of our fight could overwhelm the North Vietnamese. We were prepared for more of a conventional war than we found. More like the fights in the battlefields of World War II, and even to a certain degree in Korea. But that's not how the North Vietnamese approached the fight. And also the United States was not prepared at all for how quickly and well the North Vietnamese could resupply their soldiers using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran from Cambodia into Vietnam on one side and Laos into Vietnam on the other. Also, they didn't take fully into account the importance of the citizen soldier, the Viet Cong. Viet Cong, or VC as the American soldiers would say, it's an umbrella term that referred to the communist-driven armed movement and United Front organization in South Vietnam. It was formerly organized and led by the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam and conducted military operations under the name of the Liberation Army of South Vietnam. They were really citizen soldiers. The major force in North Vietnam were well-trained soldiers who were ready for battle at a moment's notice. But the real challenge in Vietnam became these citizen soldiers, the Viet Cong, who could wage a guerrilla war and then blend back into the population. So from the very beginning, U.S. forces were having to contend not only with a well-trained North Vietnamese army, but with a guerrilla war that was perplexing and hard to understand. And especially in the beginning, when the United States wasn't trying to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong would use innocent villagers as human shields, fire at U.S. forces. U.S. forces would fire back, killing civilians who were embedded with the VC, and therefore losing trust of the locals. So they would trust the Viet Cong more than the Americans. And this led to a very perplexing situation on the ground that American military leadership struggled to deal with. So this armed conflict that we call the Vietnam conflict, the American part of this conflict, is from a combat standpoint, as I said, began really in 1965 and lasted through 1973 with the last American military forces leaving in April of 1975. But the conflict itself actually predates that. It goes back to 1955. And again, this is why we were sending advisors during that period of time. And really, the Vietnam conflict was a proxy war of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, because Vietnam was one of the post-colonial wars of national liberation. It began as a civil war and then escalated into a global conflict. So when Harry Truman sent these first advisors in 1950, he sent them under the moniker of the Military Assistance Advisory Group, MAG. This group was replaced in 1962 by Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, when John F. Kennedy ramped up deployment of advisors. And of course, President Lyndon Johnson authorized the first deployment of combat troops to Vietnam in 1965, as I said. And this began what's called the American phase of the conflict, which lasted roughly from November 1965, when the first combat troops fought in the Ia Drang Valley, to 1970, when Vietnamization began to occur. And I'll talk more about Vietnamization a little bit later. So let's look at the leaders during this period on both sides, because I think it's important to understand the leadership mindset and why the Vietnam conflict occurred to begin with. Now keep in mind that during the early 1950s, right after this debilitating World War, which the United States and the Allies had won by vanquishing both Germany and the Empire of Japan, then the focus turned to the spread of communism throughout the world. Really, the Cold War began, this battle of ideology between Russia and China and the United States and its allies. And Southeast Asia became central in that conflict, and that's why the Americans went into what is now South Korea. And while partially the objectives were achieved there, South Korea remains a democratic nation to this day, the north part of the country was lost to the communists. During the same period of time that all this was going on, Truman was deploying advisors to Vietnam because the same situation was occurring there. And when the country, when Vietnam then was divided after the first Indochina War, it became critical in the eyes of the American administration especially to prevent Vietnam from completely falling to the communists, because if it did, not only would it create a domino effect throughout Southeast Asia, it could also erase the détente, if you will, between South Korea and North Korea and escalate the conflict there again. So let's look at these American leaders, first of all, and understand a little bit of their thought process. I'm not going to really talk about, in this podcast, Truman's and Eisenhower's view of Vietnam, although the seeds of what happened later were planted certainly all the way back to Truman and with Eisenhower as well. We have to understand that this escalation of the United States' involvement in Vietnam took place over time. And let me walk you through that very quickly. During Truman's administration and most of Eisenhower's administration, military advisors were deployed to South Vietnam, but their role was really to do exactly that: advise the South Vietnamese on how to win the Civil War against the North. There were instances where U.S. advisors were pulled into combat, but for the most part, they served in an advisory role. And I want you to listen very carefully to how the United States went from an advisory role in the 1950s to full-scale deployment in the late 1960s. In 1959, which was still within the Eisenhower administration, there were 760 American advisors in Vietnam, primarily military advisors. In 1960, that number grew to 900. Then, because of John Kennedy's concerns about this domino effect in Southeast Asia, in 1961, 33,205 advisors were deployed to assist the South Vietnamese. In 1962, that number swelled to 11,300. In 1963, the year that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, it swelled to 16,300 advisors. Then you have the advent of the Johnson administration, when it swelled to 23,300 in 1964. This was the watershed moment, 1964, because this is the moment where the Johnson administration, at least, realized that the South Vietnamese can't win on their own, and that advisors are only going to prolong this conflict. That direct intervention was necessary in order to unify Vietnam, and then to prevent and in that unification, prevent that unification from being promulgated by the communists. And herein lies the strategic conundrum in this whole conflict. Did America deploy combat forces to Vietnam in 1965 in order to win or simply to preserve South Vietnam's autonomy as a democratic nation. That argument can go back and forth. Different experts have different opinions. But history seems to reflect that America deployed forces in order to prevent the South from losing rather than to assist the South in winning. Many scholars are clear now that they believe that a situation in Vietnam akin to that in Korea, where you had the North and the South with different philosophies, would have been an acceptable solution, at least to the Americans. Not so, of course, to the North Vietnamese. So this brings us to 1965, when U.S. combat forces were deployed for the first time. And so in 1965, there was an escalation of 23,300 advisors in 1964 to 184,300 soldiers American soldiers in 1965, many of which now were combat ready. In 1966, there was another escalation to 385,300. In 1967, yet again, another escalation, 485,600. And in 1968, as the Johnson administration made the transition to the Nixon administration, we hit the high water mark as far as combat personnel in Vietnam, to 536,100. In 1969, that number dipped a little to 475,200. And then in 1970, you saw the first major reduction in U.S. combat forces to 334,600. In 71, it was 156,800. In 1972, that number was down to 24,200. And by 1973, there were only 50 U.S. personnel left in Vietnam. So what happened between 1968 and 1973 that caused this reduction in forces, and especially between 1970 and 1973? Well, that's where Vietnamization comes in. Vietnamization is a lot more complicated than I'm going to explain it, but at its grassroots, Vietnamization was President Nixon's exit strategy from Vietnam. The Vietnam conflict, and we'll talk more about this later, was wildly unpopular in the United States. Unlike World War II, which had huge support of the population, the Korean War, which had less support, but still there was a strong argument as to why the Americans needed to be in Korea to prevent the wholesale overwhelming of that part of Asia by the Chinese. Vietnam was a lot more complicated and a lot harder for the U.S. public to understand, so it was a very unpopular war. And as it began to escalate, more and more American soldiers were needed to support combat operations alongside the South Vietnamese. This created that huge escalation in 1966, 67, 68, where we reached that high water mark of more than 530,000 combat soldiers in Vietnam. And we did this primarily through the draft. And initially, the draft system was perceived as wildly unfair, as it was common knowledge that, or at least a common perception, that younger, poorer young men were being sent to Vietnam, while those from wealthier families, those going to university, were moving on with their lives. And so a lottery system then was put in place to institute fairness. And the lottery system, it was on television. I remember watching it on TV as a kid. Literally, they drew dates out of a hopper. 365 days. If it was leap year, 366. And every date was put up on a board. And every American male born on those dates that was of draft age, 18 years or over, would have to report for military duty in accordance with the sequence in which their birth date was drawn. And of that 365 to 366, if it was leap year, days, about the first 120 days, the young men born on those days were likely going to Vietnam. So if you had a low, what they call a low number, meaning that your birth date had been drawn within that first 120, you were almost assured that you were going to Vietnam. And this created this escalation. Yes, there were young men and women both that were volunteering to go into the military and go to Vietnam. But for the most part, this surge was done through the draft, which made the war wildly unpopular when combined with the fact that the counterculture movement was going on at that time. There was a real focus on peace after decades of war, World War II in Korea. And truly, young people were perplexed and didn't understand why Vietnam was our problem. They failed to buy into the U.S. leadership's argument that if Vietnam falls to communism, that all of Southeast Asia would fall to communism. Likely true, but it was not an argument that resonated with a majority of Americans, especially young Americans that were involved in both the counterculture and the youth movement on campuses across the United States. So John F. Kennedy really began this escalation, if you will, in 1962 and 1963. Followed by Lyndon Johnson, who was in a very challenging position from day one. Johnson had two choices. You either stop the escalation or stop the deployment of advisors to Vietnam, or you run the risk of Vietnam falling to the communists. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. You either continue the escalation of advisors going to South Vietnam, or you run the risk of Vietnam falling to the North. And then he faced an even bigger challenge, and that is, once it became clear that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, soldiers were not up for the fight, were not going to be able to overcome the Chinese and Soviet influence and support that North Vietnam was getting, he had to make the very difficult decision of escalating the war by sending in more the first combat troops, and then more combat troops, and really escalating it up to that high water mark in 1968. So Richard Nixon got blamed a lot for the war in Vietnam and not ending the war. But it was Johnson who really escalated the war. And I think that part of the angst that created with him made it not viable for him to run for a second full term. He finished Kennedy's term. He ran for a term of president of his own, but he declined to run for a second term. Many people believe that was because he was so demoralized and frustrated by the trajectory in Vietnam that he was not willing to preside over either a continued escalation of the war or the reality that America needed to de-escalate. And so in comes Richard Nixon, who came into a very challenging situation. But his challenge was different than Johnson's. Nixon's challenge was not of escalation, because reality had set in by that time that it was going to be very difficult to achieve America's initial goal in Vietnam. So Nixon's challenge was, how do we gain peace with honor? How do we preserve South Vietnam as a democratic state and yet not continue to have to escalate or be involved in this war for decades? And that's why he proposed Vietnamization. Basically, using U.S. combat forces to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and its allies like the Montagnards, etc., to carry on the war effort on their own, so that America could gradually move forces out of Vietnam and the ARVN could continue the fight successfully on their own. A lot of people seem to think Vietnamization was in some way the United States ingratiating themselves to the average Vietnamese citizen. That ship had sailed long ago. The control of the Viet Cong was too strong. There was too much distrust among the local population. So Vietnamization was really trying to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam well enough to be able to take this fight to the north and to, at the very minimum, preserve South Vietnam as an independent nation. Of course, Vietnamization was a categorical failure. And there were many reasons for that. One reason was that the South Vietnamese army was never ready to fight the North Vietnamese. So the concept didn't take. And this was proven during Operation Lam Son 719 from 8 to 25 March in 1971, when the American ground combat forces pulled back, advised the South Vietnamese forces on a major thrust into Laos, and supported them with helicopter cover while the South Vietnamese forces took the fight to the north. Over 500,000 sorties were flown by American helicopters, primarily, during that period in March of 1971. But Operation Lam Son 719 was an abject failure. The South Vietnamese forces bogged down. The Vietnamese forces massed at the border. It was a bloodbath. And not even America's air power through its helicopters could save the Army of the Republic of Vietnam from absolute devastation. And by the time they did reach their objective in Laos, the North Vietnamese had had plenty of time to pull out all of their materials, resources, weapons, etc. So they, in the end, they accomplished absolutely nothing except proving to the North Vietnamese that the South Vietnamese army couldn't defeat them without America's help. And quite frankly, even with America's help, at best, they were at a stalemate. This was in 1971. But back in 1970, Nixon had tried another strategy as part of Vietnamization, which was the incursion into Cambodia. Johnson had never been willing to expand the war by moving into either Cambodia or Laos. But in desperation, Nixon decided to authorize an incursion into Cambodia. It occurred from April to June 1970. And it took the North Vietnamese off guard. Just a few kilometers into Cambodia, the American forces came across a huge cache of weapons and supplies that would create devastation for the North Vietnamese army once destroyed. But that wasn't their objective. Their objective was to take out the North Vietnamese high command, which were believed to be between 20 and 25 kilometers into Cambodia. However, the backlash in the United States for expanding the war by the incursion into Cambodia was so severe that the Nixon administration determined that it would be a limited campaign, but only last for a certain amount of time, and that the United States forces would move no further than around 19 kilometers into Cambodia, falling short of the objective of taking out North Vietnamese leadership. As a matter of fact, the battalion commander that led that incursion, American incursion into Cambodia, contended for years after the war that they were a few hours away and a few kilometers away from being able to take out North Vietnamese leadership and deal a severe blow to their operational capabilities. But for political reasons, they were stopped from doing so. And of course, the reason for that was to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was the supply line for North Vietnamese personnel, supplies, weapons coming from predominantly China. But for political reasons, they pulled back. Ho Chi Minh Trail was interrupted for a while, but then reopened. They tried the same thing with the southern end of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Operation Lam Son 719 in Laos failed there as well. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail remained open. Supplies of weapons and personnel from North Vietnam continued to pour into the south at the same time that the Americans were trying to move combat forces out of Vietnam and turn it over to the South Vietnamese. It was a recipe for disaster. And Vietnamization turned out to be a very poor decision on behalf of the Nixon administration. But at the end of the day, their choices were limited. If you couldn't win, if you wouldn't expand the war, if you wouldn't take the fight to the North Vietnamese other than bombing campaigns in North Vietnam, including Hanoi, and your goal was simply to preserve South Vietnam, then you were in a stalemate, and you were in for the long haul. And the American public wouldn't stand for that. The American political trajectory or political philosophy was changing, and so Nixon had limited options, and Vietnamization appeared to be the right option at the time. So this de-escalation of forces, removal of U.S. forces, and Vietnamization led to a very seminal date, March 19, 1973, when U.S. combat forces left Vietnam and turned the fight over to the ARVN. And of course, we all know what happened from there. So that's a deep dive into three American presidents and how they viewed the Vietnam conflict and how it escalated and de-escalated under their leadership. Let's look now at the North Vietnamese leader, Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was born in 1890. His real name was Nguyen Sin Cung. He's a very mysterious figure. The details of Ho's life before he came to power are uncertain. He's known to have used between 50 and 200 pseudonyms during his life. Information on his birth and early life is ambiguous and is subject to a lot of academic debate. At least 4 existing official biographies vary on names, dates, places, and other hard facts, while unofficial biographies vary even more than that. I asked Lon on one occasion, when was Ho born? What was his life like before he was president of Vietnam? And got a very convoluted answer. Either they don't know or they're not willing to say. But Ho was not just a political figure. He was a writer, a poet, a journalist. He wrote several books and articles and poems in Chinese, Vietnamese, and French. Ho Chi Minh was not somebody who lived uneducated, who lived in the forest. He was very well educated. He lived in France and England during his youth, and for a short time even in the United States. He also lived for extended periods of time in Russia and China, which is where he began to embrace the philosophy of communism. Ho could read and write professionally in several languages, including English. He was very scholarly and very well-rounded from a worldview standpoint. But he locked into this philosophy of communism. And in 1941, he was one of the founders of the Viet Minh, the communist movement in Vietnam. In that time, French Indochina. He led the Independence Coalition. And that led to, once the French were defeated in 1954, the formation of North Vietnam and South Vietnam as separate entities divided by a treaty. The idea of overthrowing South Vietnam was debated as early as 1956. Ho Chi Minh always considered Vietnam to be one country. It really galled him that there was a North and South Vietnam. And so he made it his priority from almost the very beginning of his reign after the French to unify the country under communism. So when the Americans entered the war from a combat standpoint in 1965, Ho regularly met with his generals in order to determine how best to deal with the American fighting force. It was obvious that even with Chinese and Russian support, it was going to be difficult for the North Vietnamese to overcome U.S. air power and technology. And so they began this pseudo guerrilla war with the Viet Cong, while at the same time opening the Ho Chi Minh Trail, becoming the North Vietnamese army became very well supplied and very strategic in how they addressed the fight with the Americans. And this led to a stalemate. And by 1968, it not only had dawned on the United States that it was a stalemate, but it had dawned on Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese as well. And so, against the advice of some of his generals, Ho approved a major push in 1968 to escalate the war and hopefully win it. And that was called the Tet Offensive, which started on January 30th, 1968. And Tet was really a seminal event. It was the North Vietnamese massed forces against strategic fire bases of the Americans, attacked during a holiday when the Americans weren't prepared, and brought a huge fight to the American forces. And this was really the beginning of the end in some ways for America's will to escalate the fight in Vietnam. Ho, this enigmatic, shadowy figure, had founded the Communist Party in 1930. Of course, he ruled Vietnam from 1945 to his death in 1969 when he died of heart failure. But throughout that period, he had one purpose, and that was to unify Vietnam under communist rule. Ho's legacy is still very much intact today, although the Vietnamese government has adopted an economic system that is not totally socialist. As I said in the last episode, it's socialist laced with a liberal dose of market economy. But his legacy is still very much intact. I mean, think about it. Under his leadership, North Vietnam was able to at least fight off, if not defeat, both the French and the American forces. In the case of the French, it was an outright defeat. In the case of the Americans, all the Vietnamese had to do, the North Vietnamese had to do, and they knew this, was to outlast the Americans' will to fight. And they did that in 1973 with the removal of combat forces. And that was the American politicos' disillusion with Vietnam really was wedded to the anti-war movement in the United States. Even Martin Luther King spoke out against the Vietnam War. It was very much linked with the counterculture and the youth movements on campuses, as I said before. Protests continue to grow all over the United States, with even older adults joining into the protests. The protests against the war were promulgated in a lot of different ways, with somewhat through riots, but mostly through peaceful protest, but through literature, through song. And I want to share something with you now that was indicative of the thinking during that time and the counterculture movement's view of the Vietnam conflict during that time. And this is Country Joe McDonald from Woodstock singing what became an anthem for the anti-war movement in the United States, Vietnam song. I think that you will find that it is quite interesting, and I hope that it'll bring back some memories to some of you that certainly are of that age. Here it is. Let's hold right there. I'm not sure that's playing, and so rather than continue with silence, I'm going to go on with the narrative, and I'm going to cue this up a little bit of a different way here. So just give me 1 second to to do that. The arts and literature during this time was a very important part of the anti-Vietnam War movement, and it was one way that the counterculture could communicate their dissatisfaction to the war. So we're going to try Country Joe again here, and see if we can do a little bit of a better job this time. And, here we go. That was a struggle, but here we go. Let's try it again. That's Country Joe McDonald from Woodstock. And he was indicative of the arts movement at that time. People like Pete Seeger, Barry McGuire, others who were very much anti-war and who were driving public opinion, especially among the youth. At roughly the same time that Vietnamization was going on, in 1970, the Kent State shootings happened. A peaceful protest against the war at Kent State University resulted in 4 deaths and 9 students being wounded by live fire from the National Guard. And this was really the last straw for the war hawks, because the anti-war movement then used that as even more ammunition to de-escalate our involvement in Vietnam. So we pulled combat forces out in 1973, and on the 30th of April 1975, we pulled our last military forces out of Vietnam. That's the day that we were exiting from the roof of the United States Embassy as the North Vietnamese were entering the city. Here's a weird fact for you. The last American military person to step off of the top of the embassy on the last helicopter to leave was Master Sergeant Juan Valdez. The last soldier to leave Vietnam after all those years, dating back to 1955. In 1975, 20 years later, Juan Valdez steps onto the helicopter and leaves America's involvement in Vietnam behind. It also left more than 1 million South Vietnamese who provided aid and comfort to the United States behind as well. Only some 50,000 at that time at-risk Vietnamese were taken out in the airlift as the North Vietnamese were encroaching on the capital of Saigon. Most were left behind. And that created not only a lot of retribution on behalf of the North Vietnamese, but later contributed to the Vietnamese boat people crisis, in which nearly 250,000 people perished trying to get out of Vietnam in any way that they could. As I said in the last episode, the Vietnam War was exacted at an enormous cost. More than 970,000 Vietnamese soldiers and civilians killed, some 275 to 310,000 Cambodians, 20 to 62,000 Laotians, and 58,220 U.S. service members. And those are the ones that we can count. That doesn't even count the major civilian toll. So understanding that entire context, I think that it's incumbent on us to look at modern Vietnam through that lens. Modern Vietnam has grown into a nation that is not necessarily considered low income. It's got a growing GDP. Its brand of market economy interspersed with socialism has proven at some level to work. And I saw this directly when I was there. So at the end of the day, Vietnam is an enigma wrapped in a riddle. I don't think Americans will ever figure it out. I don't think Vietnamese will ever totally figure it out. Both sides are as perplexed as the other. And I promised you 2 episodes on Vietnam, but I'm going to give you 3 because I've got some other things that I need to say about this very complex country. And I'll do that in the next episode. But I want to leave you with this. It's a very dangerous thing to try to oversimplify something that's not simple. And nothing about the Vietnam conflict was simple. So what I've unpacked with you today, I tried to give you both sides and help you understand the philosophy of both sides in this conflict. But there are so many layers to this onion to peel back that it's going to take another episode really to do that. So I'm going to do a special episode coming up this coming Thursday. So tune in again on Thursday for a special episode to wrap up Vietnam before we start in on another country in Southeast Asia. Until then, thanks for joining the podcast, and we'll see you at the next stop along the way.